February 19, 1944. Deep within the earth of Rabaul, New Britain, in a subterranean command bunker, the hand of Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka shook almost imperceptibly as his pen scratched across his private journal, committing to paper a truth so profound and heretical it would have seen him court-martialed if Imperial headquarters ever discovered it. "The Americans," he wrote, "are not truly fighting us. They are methodically suffocating us. You see, every garrison they bypass becomes another dead weight, pulling the Empire down into the crushing dark of the ocean floor." From a narrow ventilation shaft, he could discern the low, persistent drone of B-24 liberators, a daily milk run that had woven itself into the fabric of their existence, as predictable as the rising sun ever since the Americans concluded Rabaul was a prize not worth the taking. An immense force of 100,000 Japanese soldiers, the very flower of the Imperial Army and Navy, was now marooned and impotent on this volcanic isle, condemned to watch as American naval power steamed past, ever onward toward Japan. The once unassailable fortress of Rabaul, meticulously developed into a premier fleet base and the most formidable Japanese bastion in the entire South Pacific, was now being systematically nullified without a single boot touching its shores. What Kusaka was witnessing, a reality that filled him with a dread far deeper than any banzai charge or naval shelling ever could, was the dawn of a new paradigm of warfare, one that rendered Japan's entire defensive philosophy utterly obsolete. The Americans were not adhering to the sacred rules of Bushido. They were not seeking a glorious, climactic battle. Instead, with chilling, calculated neglect, they were dismantling the Japanese empire piece by piece, expertly turning strength into a crippling weakness, transforming impenetrable fortresses into inescapable prisons. The cold arithmetic of defeat was being tallied not in the ledgers of casualties, but in the manifests of phantom ships that would never reach their destination, in the silent airfields from which a zero would never again scream into the sky, and in the soldiers who would ultimately perish not from American bullets, but from the slow, creeping tendrils of disease, starvation, and the gnawing cancer of irrelevance. The grand Japanese defensive strategy for the Pacific had been forged in the hallowed halls of the Imperial General Headquarters, possessing a beautiful, clean symmetry that sank to the military soul. Each island stronghold was conceived as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, every garrison a sharpened blade aimed directly at the heart of the American advance. This design would compel the enemy to hurl themselves against these fortified positions, bleeding their strength away against the unyielding wall of Japanese steel and spirit. Lieutenant General Hideki Tojo himself had, in September 1943, declared the creation of the Absolute National Defense Zone, a formidable defensive perimeter stretching from the southern half of Sakhalin and the Kuril Islands, down through the Bonins, the Marianas, western New Guinea, and across to Malaya and Burma. Every single strongpoint was to be defended to the last man standing. Every island was destined to become a fortress. The Americans, it was decided, would be forced to pay for every meter of sand with a river of their own blood. At Rabaul, General Hitoshi Imamura held command over 50,000 elite soldiers of the 8th Area Army. The harbor bristled with the menace of 367 anti-aircraft guns. 5 airfields stood ready to launch hundreds of aircraft into the fray. This sprawling complex incorporated Lakunai and Dinapope, pre-war Australian airstrips, alongside Rapopo, which had been operational since December 1942 with concrete runways and vast maintenance facilities, and Tobara, completed in August 1943. Miles upon miles of subterranean tunnels, carved directly from the volcanic rock, interconnected defensive emplacements, hospitals, and supply depots. Rabaul is impregnable, Imamura had confidently reported to Tokyo in November 1943. The Americans will surely shatter themselves upon our defenses, just as waves break against a mighty seawall. What neither Imamura nor the Imperial headquarters could possibly grasp was that the Americans harbored no intention whatsoever of granting them their glorious, decisive battle. The terrifying revelation began to dawn in June 1943, cleverly disguised as a Japanese victory. When American forces made landfall on Woodlark and Kirawina Islands on June 30th, Japanese commanders initially felt a surge of triumph. These islands were virtually undefended. Clearly, the Americans were afraid to challenge true Japanese strength. Captain Toshikazu Ami, an intelligence officer at Rabaul, noted in his analysis. The enemy lacks the stomach for heavy combat. They nibble at the edges like mice, terrified of the lion. Yet, something about the emerging pattern began to disturb him. The Americans were not merely seizing easy targets. They were deliberately selecting islands perfectly suited for the construction of new airfields. Woodlark and Kirawina were positioned with surgical precision to provide air cover for operations that had absolutely nothing to do with assaulting the nearby Japanese strongholds. This feeling of disquiet deepened when American forces invaded New Georgia on June 30, 1943. The Japanese had 10,500 troops defending the island, their strength centered around the vital airfield at Munda Point. At last, a real battle. But after a period of savage, unrelenting combat that raged until August, the Americans captured the airfield and then simply stopped. They made no effort to pursue the retreating Japanese forces. They did not try to pacify the entire island. They just built up Munda and moved on. Major Kenji Hatano, a survivor of the New Georgia campaign, reported back to Rabaul. The Americans fight in a different way. They seize only what they require and leave the rest to us. It is as if we ourselves do not matter to them. By November 1943, the pattern was crystallizing into something horrifyingly clear. The American offensive, codenamed Operation Cartwheel, was not designed to capture Japanese bases at all. It was designed to make them completely irrelevant. Admiral Minaichi Koga, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, had reacted to the Allied invasion of Bougainville by rushing his carrier aircraft to Rabaul. On November 1, 1943, he ordered the transfer of 173 carrier planes, 82 Zeros, 45 Type 99 dive bombers, 40 Type 97 torpedo bombers, and 6 reconnaissance aircraft, from the carriers Zuikaku, Shokaku, Zuho, Junyo, Hyo, and Ryuho to bolster Rabaul's defenses. These were not just any pilots. They were Japan's last cadre of expertly trained carrier aviators, the irreplaceable veterans who had struck Pearl Harbor, savaged the British at Ceylon, and fought at the pivotal Battle of Midway. They were the very sharpest edge of Japanese naval aviation, now committed to defending a base the Americans had already decided they would never attack. The American response was both swift and utterly devastating. On November 5, carrier planes from the USS Saratoga and USS Princeton descended upon Rabaul, inflicting heavy damage on 4 heavy and 2 light cruisers. On November 11, they returned, this time with the Essex, Bunker Hill, and Independence, and proceeded to damage most of the remaining warships. But it was what transpired next that began to truly unravel the psychological composure of the Japanese commanders. The Americans did not invade. They failed to press their advantage. They simply departed, having obliterated 121 of the 173 carrier aircraft, and killed 82 of the 193 elite aircrew. Commander Yasuo Kuwahara, a Zero pilot who survived the November battles, penned in a letter discovered long after the war. "We won. We drove them away. So why does this feel so much like we lost? They damaged our ships, they shot down our planes, and then they just sailed away. We are powerless to chase them. We cannot strike back. We can only sit and wait for them to return." Lieutenant Commander Toshikazu Ami, the senior staff officer of the Southeast Area Fleet, began to keep meticulous records, documenting what the bypass strategy meant in cold, practical terms. His classified reports, captured after the war, paint a chilling, mathematical progression of strategic strangulation. November 1943, Rabaul is receiving 30,000 tons of supplies each month. Fuel reserves are at 60%. Ammunition is adequate for 6 months of sustained combat. December 1943, supply convoys are finding it increasingly difficult to get through. American submarines now sink 2 vessels for every one that successfully arrives. Monthly deliveries have plummeted to 18,000 tons. January 1944, no surface vessels have reached Rabaul in 3 weeks. Only submarines make it through, delivering a mere 2,000 tons this month. Fuel reserves have fallen to a critical 30%. By February 1944, the Japanese High Command made the fateful decision to cease sending fighters or bombers to Rabaul, recognizing the utter futility of reinforcing a garrison that had been completely isolated. The mathematics were as simple as they were inexorable. Without supplies, even the most formidable fortress is destined to become a prison. Captain Tomichihara, commanding a destroyer squadron at Rabaul, was confronted with an impossible equation. He possessed enough fuel for perhaps one major sortie. But where could he possibly go? The Americans had seized the Admiralty Islands in February 1944, completing Rabaul's total encirclement. Every single direction led to enemy-controlled waters. "We are a fleet that cannot sail," he wrote. "We are warriors who cannot fight. We have been reduced to mere military theater, maintaining the hollow pretense of a threat, while the real war streams past us." What the Americans had uncovered, whether through brilliant, deliberate planning or a stroke of fortunate serendipity, was that the Japanese island garrisons could be defeated by the vastness of the Pacific itself. Each bypassed island transformed into a green hell, a place where the jungle, disease, and starvation performed the grim work of entire infantry divisions. Dr. Shigeki Ooka, the chief medical officer at Rabaul, documented the slow, agonizing dissolution of combat effectiveness. December 1943, cases of malaria are on the rise. Medical supplies remain adequate. Quinine reserves will last for 4 months. Combat readiness stands at 85%. March 1944, 30% of the garrison is now suffering from malaria, dengue fever, or dysentery. The quinine supply is exhausted. We are using local bark substitutes with very limited effectiveness. Combat readiness has dropped to 60%. June 1944, malnutrition has now become the primary concern. Rice rations have been cut to 400 grams per day. Soldiers are supplementing their diet with jungle plants, many of which are toxic. 17 deaths from poisonous vegetation were recorded this month. Combat readiness is now at 40%. The Americans had ingeniously turned time itself into a weapon. Every day that slipped by further weakened the Japanese garrisons, while American forces grew progressively stronger, leaping from one island to the next, constructing airfields and ports, methodically building an infrastructure of victory while Japanese strongholds were left to rot in their tropical isolation. On Wake Island, bypassed since October 1943, Captain Shigematsu Sakaibara commanded a force of approximately 4,000 Japanese troops. Once a vital refueling point for trans-Pacific flights, Wake had been morphed into a fortress, bristling with coastal guns, anti-aircraft weapons, and deep underground bunkers. The Americans simply paid it no mind. Sakaibara would eventually be promoted to Rear Admiral in October 1944, but by then his command had already become entirely irrelevant. His reports to Tokyo, transmitted using radio parts delivered by submarine, grew increasingly desperate. November 1943, enemy carrier aircraft have struck our installations. We are awaiting the invasion force. All positions are manned and ready. January 1944, no invasion has materialized. Enemy ships pass by on a weekly basis, far beyond the range of our coastal guns. Requesting instructions. April 1944, the food situation is now critical. Fishing provides some relief, but it is insufficient for the garrison. Many men are showing signs of severe malnutrition. When will the relief force come? On what atoll in the Caroline Islands, 6,426 Japanese troops under the command of Major General Katsumi Kitamura were experiencing a similar sense of profound abandonment. The Americans had captured nearby islands to use as airfields, but had left Wud's garrison to simply wither on the vine. Kitamura's diary, recovered after the war, chronicles a slow psychological disintegration. March 31, 1944, the enemy task force sailed past us again today. They were close enough to be seen through binoculars, yet they remain beyond the reach of our guns. They do not even consider us worth the effort of destroying. May 15, 1944, we received a radio message stating that all available forces are being concentrated for a decisive battle. We are not included in this plan. We have become military orphans. August 2, 1944. The men have started to cultivate gardens. This is not the work of warriors, but survival demands it of us. I fear we are becoming farmers, not soldiers. The American carrier raids that periodically struck the bypassed bases served a purpose that went far beyond mere military damage. They were, in effect, psychological operations, meticulously designed to remind the Japanese garrisons of their utter helplessness. At Truk, Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific, a force of approximately 27,000 troops and the Fourth Fleet had created what strategists considered to be an impregnable bastion. On February 17 and 18, 1944, during Operation Hailstone, the U.S. Navy's Fast Carrier Task Force conducted a series of massive air raids that annihilated over 250 aircraft, sank 2 light cruisers, 4 destroyers, and 32 merchant ships totaling 200,000 tons, and killed 4,500 Japanese personnel. Vice Admiral Masami Kobayashi, the commander at Truk, was forced to experience a commander's ultimate nightmare: irrelevance. His report to the Combined Fleet headquarters laid bare the deep psychological impact. The American carriers appeared as if from nowhere, struck with an overwhelming force, and then vanished. We could not pursue them. We could not retaliate. We could only endure the blow, repair the damage, and know with certainty that they will return whenever they choose. This is not warfare. This is torment. This very same pattern was repeated time and again across the vast expanse of the Pacific. Marcus Island, Palau, Yap, each received just enough attention from American carriers to prevent any coherent defensive planning, but never enough to provide the honorable battle that Japanese commanders so desperately craved. The fall of Saipan in July 1944 delivered the most devastating proof yet of the island-hopping strategy's chilling effectiveness. When American forces stormed the island on June 15, 1944, they arrived with overwhelming force, over 300,000 men and more than 500 ships. But what truly terrified Japanese strategists was not the assault on Saipan itself. It was the silent testament of all the fortresses they had not assaulted. Lieutenant General Yashitsugu Saito, commanding the defense of Saipan, received his final situation report on July 6, 1944, just before leading his final, desperate banzai charge. It was a catalogue of the Empire's paralyzed and useless forces. Truk, 27,000 troops, isolated, no possibility of naval support. Rabaul, 100,000 troops, isolated, reduced to growing their own vegetables. Wake, 4,000 troops, isolated, surviving on what they can fish from the sea. Marcus, 4,000 troops, isolated, the water shortage is now critical. Watch, 6,426 troops, isolated, starvation is imminent. More than 200,000 Japanese soldiers, equipped with thousands of tons of ammunition, hundreds of aircraft, and elaborate, formidable fortifications, sat completely helpless as the Americans drove relentlessly toward the Japanese mainland. These men were not casualties. They were something far worse. They were military assets that had been transformed into debilitating liabilities. When Lieutenant General Tadamaki Kuribayashi arrived on Iwo Jima in June 1944, he carried with him a revolutionary new understanding, one born from closely observing the island-hopping campaign. He recognized immediately that Iwo Jima could not possibly be held. The Americans will surely invade this Iwo Jima on their route to the mainland of Japan, he predicted, and the time of their assault will be very soon. Unlike his predecessors, who had meticulously planned for victory, Kuribayashi planned for the most effective defeat imaginable. He had studied precisely what happened to bypassed garrisons and understood the cold strategic calculus perfectly. Rather than establishing defenses on the beach to directly contest the landings, he chose a defense in depth, ordering the construction of 18 kilometers of tunnel and 5,000 cave positions deep beneath the island's surface. In a letter to his wife, which would only be delivered after his death, Kuribayashi explained his grim strategy. "I do not fight to win. That is impossible. I fight to make the Americans pay such a terrible price that they will think twice before ever invading Japan itself. Every Marine we kill here is one less who can invade the homeland. We are not defending Iwo Jima. We are defending Japan with our deaths. This represented a fundamental, seismic shift in Japanese military thinking. Kuribayashi explicitly forbade banzai charges until the final, desperate days, viewing them as a wasteful expenditure of life, and instead ordered every single soldier to fight for as long as humanly possible before being killed. The island-hopping strategy had taught Japanese commanders a bitter lesson, that a heroic death meant absolutely nothing if it did not serve a strategic purpose. What Japanese commanders were slowly coming to realize was that the Americans had revolutionized the very nature of warfare itself. The island-hopping strategy was not just about avoiding strongpoints. It was about creating a new form of military logistics that rendered traditional defensive positions completely obsolete. Commander Chihaya Takahashi, a staff officer who analyzed American operations, wrote a report that was promptly suppressed by Imperial headquarters. The Americans do not capture islands, he argued. They create floating bases. Each captured atoll becomes a fuel depot, each lagoon an anchorage, each airstrip a new projection of power. They have effectively made the Pacific Ocean itself into a highway for their war machine. The Liberty ships were being produced at a rate of 3 vessels per day during peak production. While Japanese garrisons carefully rationed their last remaining tons of rice, American construction battalions were pouring concrete for runways that could handle 100-ton bombers. Captain Minoru Genda, the tactical genius who had masterminded the Pearl Harbor attack, studied American logistics from his post in Tokyo and arrived at a chilling conclusion. We prepared ourselves for a war of warriors. They, however, are fighting a war of engineers. While we are busy perfecting the art of dying, they are perfecting the art of supply. Each garrison they bypass weakens us. Each new airfield they build strengthens them. Time itself has become our greatest enemy. Complementing the island-hopping strategy was the devastating American submarine campaign, which turned Japanese resupply efforts into virtual suicide missions. By 1944, American submarines were sinking Japanese vessels faster than they could possibly be replaced. Admiral Naokuni Nomura, commanding submarine operations from Truk, documented the sheer impossibility of supporting the bypassed garrisons. January 1944, we lost the I-169 attempting to resupply the Bougainville garrison. 40 tons of supplies were lost with her. February 1944, the I-43 was damaged by aircraft while approaching Rabaul. The mission was aborted. March 1944, the I-42 was sunk while attempting to evacuate key personnel from Wake Island. April 1944, all submarine resupply missions are suspended indefinitely. We can no longer justify the loss of our boats for such minimal supply delivery. The very submarines that had once been the lifeline for bypassed garrisons now became too precious to risk. Each isolated fortress was now truly, completely alone. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 starkly demonstrated the fatal consequences of the island-hopping strategy on Japanese naval aviation. Japan had already lost 121 of its 173 veteran carrier pilots defending Rabaul, stripping the carrier fleet of its most experienced and skilled aviators. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the mobile fleet, found himself in an impossible situation. His carriers were filled with inexperienced pilots, many of whom had less than 100 hours of flight time. The veteran instructors who should have trained them were either dead or trapped on bypassed islands. The result was the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot on June 19 to 20, 1944. Japanese losses were catastrophic. 550 to 645 aircraft were destroyed, and 3 fleet carriers, the Taiho, Shokaku, and Hyo, were sunk. Approximately 3,000 personnel were killed. In stark contrast, American losses were a mere 123 aircraft and 109 killed. The staggering 10-to-1 kill ratio reflected not just American superiority, but the profound degradation of Japanese capabilities brought about by the bypass strategy. In his after-action report, Ozawa wrote, "We have carriers without pilots, pilots without experience, and no opportunity to gain that experience. The enemy's strategy has not just defeated us, it has made it impossible for us to ever become capable of achieving victory. By mid-1944, a surreal and tragic transformation was taking place across the bypassed Japanese garrisons. Elite combat units, trained for years in the intricate art of war, were becoming little more than agricultural communes, struggling for their very survival. On Rabaul, General Imamura issued orders that would have seemed utterly insane just 2 years earlier. Effective immediately, all units will devote 50% of their daylight hours to food production. Each soldier must cultivate 100 square meters of vegetables. Unit commanders will now be evaluated on their agricultural yield, not on their combat readiness. Imamura ordered the cultivation of vast fields to accumulate harvests, recognizing that the Americans had chosen to blockade his forces rather than invade them. The mighty fortress of Rabaul, once built to threaten Allied operations across the entire Pacific, had become a vast and sprawling prison farm. Colonel Norio Kishimoto, commanding an infantry regiment, wrote in his diary, "My samurai ancestors would weep to see us now. We who were trained to die gloriously in battle are now tending sweet potatoes and raising chickens. The Americans have not just defeated us, they have humiliated us with irrelevance." Similar scenes were playing out all across the Pacific. On watch, soldiers were raising pigs. On truck, they were fishing with improvised nets. On wake, they were desperately attempting to grow vegetables in coral sand mixed with human waste. The Imperial Japanese Army, the force that had conquered half of Asia, had been reduced to subsistence farming. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of the island-hopping strategy was that it often took months, or even years, for the bypassed commanders to fully comprehend their desperate situation. Radio contact with Tokyo was maintained, orders were still issued, and promotions were still announced. The fiction of military relevance was carefully preserved, even as the reality on the ground diverged completely. General Imamura at Rabaul continued to receive operational orders from Imperial General Headquarters as late as December 1944. Prepare for a coordinated offensive in conjunction with operations in the Philippines. Maintain readiness to interdict enemy supply lines. The sheer absurdity of such orders, asking a garrison that had not seen a single supply ship in 8 months to conduct offensive operations, reveals the complete and total disconnection between the perceptions of the Japanese High Command and the grim reality of the battlefield. By April 1944, the last Japanese submarine had fled Rabaul. The last surface vessel had departed, and not a single aircraft had taken off in over a month. By early 1945, the bypass strategy had evolved into its most cruel and final phase. While there was no formal operation specifically targeting gardens, American forces did periodically bomb the agricultural efforts of the bypassed garrisons. B-24 bombers would strike the very gardens that the bypassed garrisons had so painstakingly cultivated. Fighter sweeps would machine gun their fishing boats. Even the simple attempt to survive was to be denied to them. Lieutenant Hiroshi Yamaguchi, the agricultural officer at watch, recorded, "6 months of our hard work was destroyed in just 10 minutes. The corn we had nursed from seeds, the vegetables we had watered with our own drinking rations, all of it is now burning. The Americans didn't bomb our gun positions or our ammunition dumps. They bombed our food. They know exactly what they are doing." When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, approximately 300,000 Japanese troops remained stranded on bypassed islands. At Rabaul alone, 69,000 Japanese troops were still present when Japan surrendered. These men had survived not through combat, but through cultivating gardens, fishing, and slowly, inexorably starving. The surrender created a surreal and bewildering situation. Many of the bypassed garrisons simply did not believe the surrender announcement, convinced that it was nothing more than American propaganda. Others, even if they did believe it, had no way to actually surrender. They were on islands with no American presence whatsoever. Colonel Masashi Yamamoto on Mealy Atoll in the Marshall Islands faced this very dilemma. "The war is over," he noted, "but we have no one to surrender to. The Americans bypassed us so thoroughly that they have forgotten we even exist. We must simply wait for them to remember us." Some garrisons waited for weeks, or even months, before American forces finally arrived to accept their surrender. During this time, they existed in a strange and unsettling limbo, no longer at war, but not yet at peace. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the architect of the Central Pacific Campaign, would later reflect on the island-hopping strategy. "We learned," he said, "that the quickest way to defeat Japan was not to fight the Japanese. Every bypassed island represented thousands of soldiers we didn't have to kill, tons of ammunition we didn't have to expend, and American lives we didn't have to sacrifice. We simply turned their own strength against them." General Douglas MacArthur, though initially resistant to the idea of bypassing major targets, eventually came to recognize the strategy's brilliance, particularly after the decision to bypass Rabaul saved an enormous number of Allied casualties. But perhaps the most telling assessment of all came from Admiral Mato Magaki, Chief of Staff of the Combined Fleet, who wrote in his diary in February 1945, "The Americans have discovered the perfect strategy to use against the Japanese warrior spirit. They have made our courage irrelevant, our fortifications useless, and our Bushido meaningless. We prepared ourselves to die gloriously. They, instead, have sentenced us to live shamefully. This is worse than defeat. This is erasure." The cold mathematics of the island-hopping strategy reveal its devastating effectiveness. The Japanese forces bypassed were immense. Rabaul, with 100,000 troops initially and 69,000 at the time of surrender; Truk, with approximately 27,000 troops; Wuch, with 6,426 troops of whom only 1,650 survived to surrender; Wake, with 4,000 troops; Marcus, also with 4,000 troops, and various other garrisons, numbering in the tens of thousands more. In total, an estimated 300,000 Japanese troops were completely neutralized without ever engaging in major combat. The strategic success rate was staggering. Of the 26 major Japanese bases that were bypassed, not a single one managed to significantly interfere with American operations after being isolated. The island-hopping strategy's greatest success, however, was not military, but psychological. It shattered the fundamental assumptions upon which Japanese military doctrine was built. Japanese strategy had always aimed for a decisive battle, a kessen, where their superior spiritual strength would overcome any material disadvantage. The Americans simply refused to provide them with one. Japan had spent decades fortifying its Pacific islands. The Americans demonstrated that fortifications only matter if someone actually attacks them. Japanese military culture glorified death in combat above all else. The Americans sentenced them to survival and utter irrelevance. Japanese doctrine held that a superior will could overcome any material disadvantage. The Americans made will itself completely irrelevant. Captain Yoshitaka Shindo, an intelligence officer on the bypassed Marcus Island, wrote what is perhaps the most perceptive analysis of all. "We were prepared for American strength. We were prepared for American technology. We were not prepared for American indifference. They have found the one thing that the Japanese warrior cannot fight, being ignored." By late 1944, some Japanese commanders had begun to understand and adapt to this new and terrifying reality, but it was far too late. Lieutenant General Kuribayashi at Iwo Jima had studied the island-hopping campaign and designed his defense accordingly, not to win, but to make victory so costly that the Americans would reconsider their plan to invade Japan itself. His approach: no banzai charges, no attempts to hold the beaches, fighting from elaborate and extensive tunnel systems, represented a complete and total rejection of traditional Japanese tactics. He had learned from the bypass strategy that the only true value of a defensive position was the cost it could inflict on an attacker who chose to attack it. His defense extended the expected 5-day battle into a grueling 36-day ordeal, inflicting nearly 26,000 American casualties, including 6,821 killed. General Holland Smith would later call Kuribayashi the most redoubtable of all our Pacific adversaries. Similarly, the defense of Okinawa in 1945 showed a clear Japanese adaptation to the lessons of island hopping. Instead of attempting to defeat the invasion outright, The defenders sought to make it so costly that America would seek a negotiated peace rather than dare to invade the Japanese homeland. The greatest irony of the island-hopping strategy was that it used Japan's own unwavering dedication against itself. Every bypassed garrison that refused to surrender, every soldier who chose death over what they saw as dishonor, every commander who followed their orders to hold their position at all costs, became a self-imposed prisoner. The Americans had expected the bypassed garrisons to collapse quickly, but many survived for far longer than anticipated by cultivating gardens and working with local populations. This survival, which under other circumstances might have been seen as an admirable display of resilience, instead only served to prolong their suffering and their irrelevance. General Imamura, reflecting after the war, observed, "We trapped ourselves with our own code. Surrender was impossible. Retreat was forbidden. And so we remained. The Americans didn't need to defeat us. We defeated ourselves by our inability to adapt to their strategy." For the bypassed garrisons, the end of the war brought not relief, but a profound sense of confusion. At Rabaul, General Imamura and Admiral Kusaka formally surrendered on September 6, 1945, aboard the HMS Glory, but they were surrendering forces that had not been militarily relevant for over a year. Many of the smaller garrisons experienced even stranger endings. On Anatahan Island, 32 Japanese soldiers refused to believe that the war had ended and continued to fight against no one until 1951. They maintained their military discipline, conducted patrols, and prepared for an American invasion that had been cancelled 6 years earlier. These holdouts represented the logical and tragic extreme of the bypass strategy's psychological impact. So thoroughly had their military purpose been negated that they simply could not conceive of a world in which they no longer mattered. Beyond the strategic implications, the island-hopping strategy inflicted a uniquely cruel form of suffering upon the Japanese forces. Combat, however terrible it may be, at least offers a sense of meaning: death in service of the emperor, sacrifice for the nation. The bypassed garrisons were denied even this cold comfort. Private Kazuo Sakamaki, stationed at Wutch, wrote, "We do not fear death. We fear meaninglessness. Every day, we wake up, we conduct military drills for battles that will never come, we maintain weapons that will never be fired, and we pretend that we are soldiers when we are actually prisoners of our own making." The medical records from these bypassed garrisons revealed the devastating human toll. Malnutrition affected 80% of the troops, disease rates exceeded 60%, and psychological disorders were endemic. Suicide rates increased dramatically compared to those in active combat units. The island-hopping strategy fundamentally changed the nature of warfare in ways that extended far beyond World War II. It demonstrated that controlling key geographic points did not necessarily mean controlling a region. Traditional military thinking was completely overturned. The Americans proved that you could control the vast Pacific while largely ignoring its strongpoints. The strategy showed that superior supply lines and industrial capacity could negate almost any tactical advantage. Time itself became a weapon. By accelerating their own operations while slowing the enemy's, the Americans turned the very passage of time into a strategic advantage. Most importantly, it proved that psychological impact could far exceed physical damage. In 1965, 20 years after the war's end, the former General Hitoshi Imamura published his memoirs. After his conviction for war crimes, he had built a replica of his prison cell in his garden and chose to live there until his death in 1968, donating all the proceeds from his writings to the families of Allied prisoners who had died under his command. His assessment of the island-hopping strategy was both professional and deeply personal. "We studied Napoleon, Clausewitz, Sun Tzu. We prepared for every form of warfare that we could possibly imagine. But the Americans created a new form that we had never imagined: warfare by avoidance, victory through irrelevance. They turned our greatest strength, our willingness to die for our positions, into our greatest weakness. At Rabaul, I commanded 100,000 of Japan's finest soldiers. We had ammunition for years of combat, fortifications that could withstand any assault, and the will to fight to the very last man. None of it mattered. The Americans sailed past us toward Japan, and we could only watch. We were an army of ghosts, haunting positions that no longer mattered, defending territory that had no value, waiting for battles that would never come. This was their genius. They made us defeat ourselves. Every day that we held our positions, we weakened Japan. Every soldier growing vegetables at Rabaul was one less soldier defending the homeland. We were not defeated. We were erased. Future military leaders should study the American island-hopping strategy, not for its tactical brilliance, but for its strategic revolution. It proved that the best way to defeat an enemy position is not to attack it, but to make it irrelevant. The best way to win a war is to redefine victory itself. We terrified ourselves with our own impotence. We had trained our entire lives for a glorious death in combat. The Americans sentenced us to a meaningless life in isolation. There is no warrior code that prepares you for irrelevance. We were warriors from an ancient tradition, fighting an enemy from the future. They did not defeat our strategy. They made strategy itself obsolete. This was the true terror of the island-hopping campaign. It showed us that everything we believed about warfare was wrong. The most poignant testament to the island-hopping strategy's psychological impact came from Lieutenant Hiro Onoda, who continued to fight on Lubang Island in the Philippines until 1974, 29 years after the war had actually ended. Deployed to Lubang on December 26, 1944, with strict orders never to surrender, Onoda held out with 3 other soldiers until he was the last survivor. On March 9, 1974, his former commanding officer, Major Yoshimi Taniguchi, was flown to Lubang and formally relieved him of his duty. Onoda surrendered on March 10, 1974, with his rifle still in functioning order, 500 rounds of ammunition, and his 30-year-old uniform still intact. When he was asked why he had continued for so long, Onoda simply replied, "I was waiting for the war to come back to me. I never imagined that it would leave me behind forever." The Japanese were terrified by America's island-hopping strategy because it represented something far worse than defeat. It represented meaninglessness. Every military tradition, every cultural value, every strategic assumption was turned against them. They had prepared for a war of warriors and found themselves facing instead a war of engineers and logisticians who treated their island fortresses like mere obstacles to be driven around, rather than enemies to be fought. The approximately 300,000 Japanese troops on the bypassed islands didn't just lose the war, they were written out of it. While they maintained their positions, grew their gardens, and slowly starved, the war simply moved on without them. They were not conquered, they were discarded. They were not defeated, they were ignored. In his final entry before Japan's surrender, Admiral Kosaka at Rabaul wrote, "The Americans have taught us the cruelest lesson of war, that there is something worse than death in battle, irrelevance in victory. We were the Emperor's finest warriors, reduced to growing sweet potatoes while the enemy sailed past us toward the homeland. We were prepared to die gloriously. Instead, we lived meaninglessly. This was their ultimate weapon. Not bombs or bullets, but obsolescence itself." The island-hopping strategy succeeded because it attacked not Japanese positions, but Japanese purpose, not bodies, but beliefs, not fortifications, but the fundamental assumptions about the nature of war itself. It turned the Pacific Ocean from a field of battle into a highway to victory, and transformed Japanese strongholds from fortresses into prisons of their own making. The terror it inspired came not from what it did, but from what it did not do. It did not provide the glorious battle that Japanese warriors craved. It did not validate their sacrifice. It did not even acknowledge their existence. It simply passed them by, leaving them to discover that the worst fate for a warrior is not death, it's irrelevance. The warriors of the Empire of the Rising Sun discovered that the setting sun casts the longest shadows. And in those shadows, forgotten armies slowly faded into nothing, defeated not by their enemies, but by their absence. They had seen the future of warfare, and in it, they had no place.